Food. It means something different to each and every one of us. So many different cuisines and cultures, all represented by one small word. It's a part of each one of our lives, and it has been ever since earliest man felt that familiar rumbling in his belly. And this podcast aims to tell the most interesting stories about food from that time all the way until now. So join me as we explore the fantastic history of food. I'm your host, Nick Charlie Key. Thank you for joining me again for Season 2 of the Fantastic History of Food. It's been a roller coaster ride these last few months as my wife and I have settled into our new routine as parents to our first little baby boy. I'm so excited to share some more great stories with you this season, and I would really appreciate your help in getting the word out there about the show. If I could be so bold as to ask you to help by sharing episodes on social media, rating us on Apple Podcasts or your preferred platform, and if you'd like to be a true hero, please won't you consider supporting the show on Patreon to help me continue making this podcast that I love so much. The link to my Patreon will be in the show notes on your app. All right, now, on with the show. If you have a history podcast, it's simply a matter of time before at least one of your stories involves Adolf Hitler. This is probably a story about him that you won't have heard before. It does involve Hitler and World War II, but it also involves whale hunting and a desperate need for German margarine. But how did we get here? Well, we need to go back a few years to understand the rationale behind this bizarre tale. Adolf Hitler served as a corporal in the First World War, and he witnessed firsthand how Germany was brought to its knees by the British naval blockade. The warships slowly strangled the German supply lines and eventually forced them into submission. Defeat was tough for him to take, and he felt shame at his country's surrender. Fast forward a number of years, and now he is the one in power and calling the shots, and he was adamant that he wouldn't make the same mistakes his predecessors had. It was crucial to Hitler that the Nazi forces were not dependent on foreign supply lines, and in fact, he aimed to circumvent them altogether. He gave this ambitious task to another famous Nazi leader who was known to be Hitler's right-hand man. We're talking, of course, about the morphine-addicted founder of the Gestapo, Hermann Goering. A thoroughly sinister man in his own right, Goering was responsible for making sure that Germany ultimately became self-sufficient. By this time, it was 1936, and Hitler had laid out his 4-year plan for ensuring that Germany hunkered down well and had everything they would need to see them through the upcoming war. This plan was not merely about food supplies, but included weapons as well as other commodities. Hitler was so obsessed with making sure they didn't run out of food that he also enforced a ban on the distillation of potatoes that were being turned into alcohol. But it wasn't alcohol or potatoes that were his major concern. No, it was something rather more mundane than that: margarine. Before Hitler had even come to power, the German people had become hooked on the butter replacement as a cheaper and more readily available alternative. By 1930, the population had become so hooked on the stuff, in fact, that estimates say each and every German citizen was consuming nearly 20 pounds of the stuff each year. This spreadable butter alternative became a fast favorite among the working class families of Germany, in exactly the way that it hadn't in France. Originally, having been a French invention, the citizens there despised it as anti-gastronomy and saw it as an incredibly low-class foodstuff. Subsequently, it was sold off to Northern European countries where it began to find favor among the populations, but none more so than in Germany. The margarine industry is still the single biggest buyer of advertising in German history, spending more money than anyone else by a rather considerable margin. In fact, the very first advert ever played on German radio was for margarine. Likewise, the first ever advert on a cinema newsreel. During the 1920s, every print magazine in Germany was propped up by the money coming in from margarine ads, especially since after the First World War, the glycerin that had been used for explosives could go back into the production of margarine. It was just around the time that Hitler was coming to power that German margarine manufacturers began replacing cow's milk with leftover animal fat. Manufacturers soon worked out that the cheapest way to produce large amounts of animal fat was by catching whales. The only problem was, Germany didn't have a direct line to the source. Whale oil had for years been used as fuel for lighting lamps, but with the invention of kerosene, a large whale oil surplus was created and prices dropped to rock bottom. Two companies, one Dutch and one British, purchased almost all of the surplus in order to monopolize the manufacturing of margarine. This left Hitler and Goering with a problem on their hands. While margarine itself was clearly a big concern for Hitler, whale oil was also fairly vital to the actual war effort itself. Liquid whale blubber was widely used as machine lubricant, as well as being crucial to the manufacture of nitroglycerin, the main component needed for explosives. It was so vital, in fact, that Britain declared whale oil a national defense commodity in the year that World War II broke out. So where did all of this whale oil come from? Most of it was the product of Norwegian whaling expeditions, who were at this time the world leaders in whale hunting. They had ships up and down the unclaimed Antarctic coastline of what is today called Queen Maud Land. Norway believed they had claimed this land and the corresponding waters, but while this claim had not been officially recognized by other countries, it seemed not to be too much of an issue. 2 years into Hitler's 4-year plan for self-sufficiency, Goering had begun to feel the heat, as he didn't have too much to show for his efforts. It was at this point that the German Chancellor of State pitched him an incredibly ambitious idea. The German Foreign Office had found out that the land Norway was claiming was in fact unclaimed territory in between an existing Norwegian zone and a British zone on the other side. The plan would be to steal Norway's claim to this coastline and its surrounding waters, and thereby claim access to the incredible whale oil resources for themselves. Goering was sold, and in May of 1938, planning began for their Antarctic expedition. Germany immediately began ramping up their production of whaling ships in anticipation of this new plan to build an Antarctic base of operations in the Southern Ocean. It seems awfully far from home for it to be a viable option for them, but commercial whaling had been decimated in the North Atlantic as well as the North Pacific. German whaling ships were already having to travel far from home to gather these resources, so the idea of establishing their own base seemed like a great idea. They put together a rather mismatched crew of soldiers, scientists, and whale hunters, all led by a decorated World War I naval commander named Alfred Reacher. After the First World War, he had fallen in love with and married a prominent Jewish artist. Being that Captain Reacher was a staunch supporter of the Nazi Party, and upon seeing the tide of popular opinion turning against the Jews, he decided to divorce his wife in 1934 before it could impact his military career. The ship he was given to command on this expedition was not a regular whaling vessel, but rather an old freighter built by Lufthansa Airlines. This was a ship from which they could catapult 2 10-ton seaplanes off the deck. It took them 3 months to turn this vessel into an icebreaker ship, and on December 17, 1938, the captain and his crew of 82 scientists, officers, and soldiers set sail from Hamburg. His crew had been selected more for their collective polar experience rather than any sort of military prowess. The idea for this first trip was mainly a reconnaissance mission to do surveillance on the land, planning for further expeditions, and most importantly, to lay claim to the territory they were already calling New Schwabenland. The ship sailed for just over a month down along the coast of Africa and eventually reached the Antarctic coastline. As soon as they arrived, they loaded 2 planes into the catapults and shot them out over the icy terrain around them. The mountains in that region had never been explored or even surveyed before, which made the data they recorded incredibly valuable for research purposes. But it was not purely for research that the planes were sent out over the land. In fact, they were also there to drop hundreds of 4.5-foot metal spikes with swastikas etched into them. These spikes were meant to be plunged deep into the Antarctic ice and serve as physical proof of their claim on the land. But this didn't go quite to plan. One of the planes ventured a bit too far out on their mapping expedition, and on their return journey found they were running low on fuel. The crew, upon realizing this, scrambled to lessen the weight aboard the plane and so threw out anything heavy they could get their hands on. It just so happened that they were carrying a number of boxes carrying these swastika claim darts meant to be dispersed all across the ice. It didn't take them long before deciding to dump all of the boxes in one go, and unfortunately for them, these swastika darts have never been recovered. Not that it would have actually mattered, because just a few weeks later, Norway, having been tipped off to Germany's plan, would make their claim over Queen Maud Land official by royal proclamation, thereby scuppering any chances the Germans had of creating a viable supply line. The Germans, however, refused to accept this and announced their own claim on the land, but it was summarily dismissed by almost every country on Earth, and so, defeated, the vessel left in early February to make the month-long trip back to Europe. The trip had not been a total failure, however, as they had conducted some critical military research into how aeroplanes performed in extremely low temperatures, information they would later come to use when advancing into the Soviet Union. On the way back to Europe, the scientists conducted some scans of the sea floor along the Atlantic Ocean. They detected a line of volcanic activity running north to south along the middle of the seafloor, what we know now as the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. Many years later, after the war, conspiracy theories spread about the real reason for this failed German mission. Some people claim that the point of the mission was in fact to locate hidden entrances to a network of caves and tunnels that led down into the center of the planet. This was all part of a theory called the Hollow Earth, and it was supposedly one of the places that Hitler and some other senior Nazi officials could have escaped to after the war. But I'll leave that up to your imagination. Returning to Germany empty-handed didn't look good, and soon Goering was on the hunt for yet another way to create this sought-after staple. As luck would have it, he came across a scientist in the Ruhr area of Germany who had begun developing alternative methods of making margarine. But there was only one problem. One giant problem for a Nazi such as Hermann Goering. The scientist was Jewish. The man's name was Arthur Imhausen, which sounded German enough, and so Goering, in the interest of margarine production, pronounced him only half Jewish. Even so, in Nazi Germany, this would still have been enough to have sent him to a concentration camp, but luckily for him, he was allowed to build and run his alternative margarine factory. Arthur Imhausen had discovered a method by which he could synthesize soap from coal, and had begun working on a way to use this method to synthesize the fat from coal to produce margarine as well. The Nazi Party, desperate as they were for margarine, gave him plenty of money and help, and before long he had begun producing a kind of margarine that could be stored outside of refrigeration and even then would never go rotten. This was like a miracle, and when Goering informed Hitler of this discovery, he was thrilled. They called Imhausen in for a meeting, and despite his Jewish heritage, he was told that as payment, he and his family would be treated as honorary Aryans and would be afforded all of the same privileges. Arthur Imhausen would go on to be awarded 2 of Germany's highest military medals for his work and would end up surviving the war. The Imhausen company that he started was also allowed to continue operating in Germany after the war ended, despite their work aiding the Nazi military machine. He himself died not long after the war ended in 1951, but his company still lives on today. Despite how or where the margarine was made, during the war it was not on the list of rationed food items, mainly because it was too difficult to police people's consumption of it. So, Germans were free to consume as much as they could get their hands on, and although they didn't quite fulfill their plans of establishing a margarine factory in Antarctica, it would soon prove to be quite the least of their worries. Thank you for listening to this episode of The Fantastic History of Food. If you'd like to get in touch, you can find us on Twitter at Food History Pod, as well as checking out our Facebook page. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd really appreciate you taking a moment to rate the show on Apple Podcasts or whatever platform you listen on, and if you can, leave a review as well. I also have a Patreon account where you can support the show and get access to exclusive content, bonus episodes, and even the chance to choose the topic for an upcoming episode. But all of this is only for our Patreon subscribers. Everyone who donates or subscribes will also get a personal shout out from me on an upcoming episode. Check out our website where you can find transcripts, show notes, and references for each and every episode at foodhistorypodcast.com.